David Left Center for International Communication. Our speaker this afternoon is Professor Michael Harrison of Chinese University of Hong Kong. I first knew Michael through his research, and he was more impressed by Michael's Canadian. Professor Long has spent over 3 decades in Hong Kong with another 3 years in Japan. Dr. Long has authored numerous articles and books, including Beyond Chinese Thinking and the Social Psychology of Subculture. Today we'll talk about what Chinese people believe about the world, social, scientific approach related to epistemology. Dr. Long's presentation will be followed by a period.
Thank you, others, for the welcome. Always a warm welcome at the forum, and particularly appreciative of the eager audiences that you draw.
You draw.
Well, thank you. We said in Cantonese culture, you and I are one, connected by these interests. Warm welcome, particularly appreciated for this person who has survived now 30 years, 30 winters, I might say, in Hong Kong. Because this morning as I was walking the street, I was reminded of Mark Twain's comment that the coldest winter he ever spent was the summer in San Francisco. Perhaps he should have gone a little further north. This is about as cold as I would like to have it myself, having acclimatized over these many years to a Hong Kong environment. I don't think this winter in Hong Kong got much colder than it was this morning as I was looking for a bagel with cheese and eggs on my streets when I returned to the place where I was born and learning it for the first time. I will speak for an hour and 10 minutes and set my watch now, and there'll be opportunities for questions. I want definitely to create those opportunities for questions as I'm interested in how this presentation interfaces with your own discrete and personal interests in things Chinese. This work is, I would say, the culmination of my 30 years of doing social psychology in and out of a Chinese context, specifically Hong Kong, where I arrived on August the 10th, 1974, wondering what was going on. And I'm still wondering what's going on. I think I have a few more ideas about what's going on. But life is becoming much more complicated these days because we have moved beyond the background of 1974, where we were interested in simplistic two-culture comparisons, usually one North American exemplar, typically the United States, and then we would contrast it with a readily available target population, in my case, Hong Kong Chinese, and prior to that, when I was in Japan, of course, Japanese. And that line of work has continued, of course, but it's led to a broadening of the mapping in terms of multicultural studies that people have been able to undertake with the advent of technology and increased networking among cross-culturalists themselves. We have, for example, a biannual meeting will be held this year for the International Association of Cross-Cultural Psychology in Xi'an, China. And the society has really gone from strength to strength with the diversity movement, and of course this diversity movement, as we all know, sustained by basic liberal democratic interests of academics and also a very supportive and interested business community who indirectly are paying my salary, I would say. And to them, I offer a vote of thanks and appreciation. And I hope that we can do something that's relevant and useful for you, provide you with usable information about how to work with people designated as Chinese. I say we because the work I'm going to present is really the brainchild of myself and Lynn Kwok, my collaborator across many, many publications over the last 2 decades. He arrived at my office in 1981, a 19-year-old biology student. We didn't have a psychology major at that time. And after a few short minutes of conversation, I knew that I was dealing with a peer and that students could be teachers, as they remind us constantly in Chinese philosophy. I think the Cantonese pronunciation for that proverb is Gao Hak San Jia. For those of you who work in Cantonese, Jen, you understand, you could probably even translate it into Mandarin.
教学相长。
Thank you very much. But that's a guiding principle. And in my office, I have a wonderful Chinese proverb, which Jan will also be able to gloss for us. When 3 people are walking together, one of them is your teacher.
Is my teacher. 三人行，必有我师焉。That's from Confucius Analyst.
Yes. And I do like to remind my students that I'm never sure who is the teacher and who is the student. This is a disarming introduction from many students, of course, but it does set the agenda, as it did with Glenn Kwok. And it's been my privilege to work with him over these many years. He's a very resourceful, creative, and conceptually sophisticated social psychologist who's taught me a tremendous amount about culture. Is always reminding me not to overplay the Chinese culture card, because as a foreigner, it was very salient to me that I was dealing with Chinese persons, and I was constantly invited to be interpreting differences with respect to culture rather than universal processes. And you may see that theme played out in the course of the presentation that I'm making today. The presentation is what Chinese people believe about the world. A rather ambitious title, and I apologize for what appears after the colon. A social scientific approach to lay epistemology. That's meant to be an academic qualification, so you don't come to anticipate more than I can possibly deliver. You'll see why I'm giving that introduction as we get further into the talk. Okay, the world in which we must each function. I want to begin with the question of what do we need to know as humans when we encounter a world? What do we need to learn about in order to be effective members of that particular setting in which we become socialized? And I'm just using this particular visual to remind us that the world is not just the physical world that we often, the material world, as it were, but also includes the world, the social world in which we must function, and we develop beliefs about how that world works and what is necessary to make it work effectively for us, but also the spiritual world, and also the world of personality, the world of individual psychology. What is it that we think we need to know in order to function effectively? Individual behavior is a function of personal force plus situational constraints or opportunities, also known as affordances. This is the basic social psychological principle that we hear when we take an introductory course in social psychology. That is to say that if we want to understand behavior, we need to know the personality component that people bring to the interaction, plus some way of understanding the forces that are at work within the social situation that we and they are encountering. We have done a very good job in assessing what are the personality contributions towards that equation. We have done a very poor job in assessing what is the nature of the social situation in which people are functioning. Melvin Seaman called it the elusive situation in his presidential address to the American Sociological Association in 1997. Elusive in the sense that we have found very few ways of characterizing the kind of situation in which people think they're functioning. What is it out there that is happening? What's out there? One set of constraints are perceptions of truths about how the world operates. Now, the world I want you to understand in terms of its material, psychological, social, and spiritual features.
What is it that is confronting us as individuals? What are those beliefs and how do they vary across people and across cultural groups? That is the descriptive component of what we need to do when we work on culture. And then the final kicker and what, that explanatory component that we need to put into place once we've done the descriptive work. But I submit that there are many areas in psychology where we have not even begun to do the descriptive work. And this is one attempt to look at one aspect of the descriptive work that we need to have in place if we're in the business of explaining behavior, understanding why people do what it is they do. And of course, that's the great puzzle, as Alice would say, when we work across cultural lines. Why do they do that? Why do they not do that? Those are the fundamental textbook candidates that we are confronted with when we function across cultures. And of course, I'm going to do it in a way as suggested by this wonderful print with Escher's, in the sense of looking at how each individual construes and can see or perceive the world in which they function. They are not perceiving themselves, they're perceiving what is out there. That's an important distinction because most personality psychology deals with what you perceive in yourself, what you think you bring to the equation, not what you think you confront out there. We're going to look at what you think you confront out there. Okay, the origins of the Axioms Project. Well, they probably occurred as I was having a dream, or possibly when I was swimming laps at the wonderful 50-meter Olympic swimming pool at Chengdu. But I expect they were in Van Gogh's bedroom. Culture has generally been discussed, as you know, publicly and studied scientifically in terms of the values construct. And we're all familiar with the various attempts that have been made to distinguish and characterize cultural groups in terms of the values held by the individuals who are members of that culture and which are embodied or instantiated in the institutions of the culture in which they grow up. That's a very familiar routine that we have been working in social science for the last 34 years, certainly since the magisterial work of Geert Hofstede, to which some of us subsequently contributed. And I think we probably exhausted that field with the definitive work done by Shalom Schwartz at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Can we find other ways, other important ways in which to begin characterizing and distinguishing people from different cultural groups? Are people and their cultural groups, in fact, more similar than different in their values? This is one of the basic thoughts that Lundquist and I threw around one to another as we did this kind of work, and we felt a resonance with any of the value positions that people might want to adopt. We could identify them within ourselves, and we thought that probably most people in most cultures would do so. For example, if you look at the Schwartz Value Survey, one of its domains is the domain of power, and you can indeed contrast people with different cultural groups in terms of their endorsement of power. Chinese tend to be very high in terms of their endorsement of power relative to other groups. What is not readily apparent from looking at that work is the fact that power as a domain of value that people endorse is the lowest, receives the lowest level of endorsement of all 10 of Schwartz's value domains, regardless of what cultural group we're talking about. So the universal in the system, if you like, is that power is endorsed at the lowest level relative to all of the other possible values that people may endorse. It's relatively less endorsed in Chinese cultures than in other cultures. But still, the big picture is that there is a very high similarity across these samples in terms of the relative levels of endorsement of the 10 domains of values that Schwartz has identified. For example, is the value construct also suspect because it's pitched at too general a level to predict individual behaviors strongly? Now, you know that's happening when people can find that a given value can explain almost any behavior they have a mind to try and explain. It's rather like the old Freudian system. And the ease with which people who had a passing understanding of Freudian psychodynamics could explain any kind of behavior using some kind of marriage of id, ego, and superego mixed together with their favorite belt and dressing. That's a very common way in which the values construct, I'm afraid, has been used rather loosely, rather glibly in social science. And we are concerned about that because clearly there are other ways to look at cultural systems. But can we get a handle on them? And can we overthrow this colossus of value that has beset us for the last 30 years? I'm also part of the problem, I should add. I'm not innocent in this score. I certainly jumped on the values bandwagon and tried to use it and make sense of it in terms of what it does. Okay. We developed some general hypotheses about beliefs, and I'll share them with you because they're the guiding inputs that we made to doing this kind of study. And we were focusing on the question of whether or not we could get extra mileage out of a construct like beliefs. And how would that work? So we were comparing ourselves always to values, and we asked whether or not beliefs were a cognitive construct that could show a broader set of differences among individuals than values. Is it, in fact, a more discriminating construct in the sense that we would find people within this room, for example, much more likely to differ in terms of their beliefs than in terms of their values? That's what we need. We need that foothold of difference if we're going to do social science, and we're going to predict differences in behavior. We need to have a principle, an operating tool, which will allow us to discriminate. And some of the great advances, of course, in science have been made when technology becomes apparent, available, which will give more precise and finer discrimination among the various phenomena that are to be explained. Is our beliefs more closely related to behaviors and values? Walk and I came to this sort of intuition when we were discussing harmony and the great belief in social science that there is a greater emphasis on harmony in Chinese culture than in other cultural systems, and that harmony construct, the value of harmony, could be used to explain a lot of phenomena. In fact, the data do not indicate the Chinese value harmony more strongly than Westerners, surprisingly. And Guok was always saying to me in our conversations that it's not the goal of harmony that distinguishes Chinese from non-Chinese. It's the procedures you adopt for achieving a state of harmony. Now, those procedures are the outcome of beliefs about how to get from a state of chaos or unrelatedness to a state of harmony or interconnectedness. Now, are those beliefs different across cultural groups? And we expect that they were, and that they were the responsible agent for the differences in behavior we observed, not a different emphasis on harmony as a value. Of course, when you do social science, then you want to keep yourself honest and not merely famous. You want to make sure that anything you're adding to this gargantua called social science is actually doing some functional work. Lots of people have developed personality scales that have their names attached to them. But if we did a massive factor analysis of all of these personality scales, how many differences, how many constructs, how many constellations would we really have? My guess is not that many. That these are differently named features of the same fundamental construct. How many do we actually need? Well, probably not too many more. So if we're going to develop and advance this belief construct, one of the things we wanted to make sure was that we were actually adding value to the scientific corpus. Adding value means that you add predictive power to something that's already available. If it doesn't add any predictive power, you're just renaming it. You're not adding anything new in the science. All right, definitions and orientations. So, what is a belief? What are we referring to when we talk about beliefs? This is a fundamental issue. We talk about social axioms in the old mathematical sense of axioms. The axioms are generalized beliefs about people, about the social environment, or about the spiritual and physical world. That's our target, our domain of interest. It's not about you as a distinctive person. It's not about whether you think you have high levels of self-efficacy, for example, or a low level of self-efficacy. That's a personal belief that you take to your interactions based upon your socialized history, based upon your assessments of yourself. We are not dealing with that. We are not dealing with that typical domain of personality theory. We're not interested in whether the Chinese have a higher or lower level sense of group efficacy, for example. One of the issues that is currently of interest to people in social learning theory. No, we're focusing instead upon beliefs, not about yourself, but about the world you confront when you are interacting. A belief is a statement about the relationship among entities. A causes B is a statement about a relationship among entities. As an example, hard work leads to reward. We're not asking whether you value hard work. We're not asking whether you value a reward. We're asking whether you consider that there is a connection between working hard and any kind of outcome that may emerge from it. Surprisingly, of course, there are lots of people in this world who believe that there is no connection between how hard they work and what kinds of outcomes the world provides for them. Other people believe very strongly in such a connection. Now, if you wanted to predict their behavior, I suggest to you that it would be very useful to know what their belief is, not what their value is for rewards. They're probably pretty much the same. Everybody wants a good set of rewards from their interactions with the world. But do they believe that kinds of inputs they might make will lead to those rewards? That's a hugely important and significant question. It asserts a truth for the individual. Now notice, remember the Escher image that I want you to hold in your mind. This is the individual's perception of what is true. But I submit to you that it's what each of us believes is true that will be guiding our individual behavior. And that's why we need to have this kind of information as psychologists. Okay, definitions. I borrowed from Cass way back in 1960. Some of these old-timers had the basic intuitions we never carried out, followed on their footsteps. But here is Cass in 60 saying, it's the description and perception of an object, its characteristics, and its relationship with other objects. That's the basic definition. But let's keep in mind that object is not merely a physical object. It could be a social category like Chinese-born Canadians. It's a category. Chinese-born Canadians are hardworking. That's a belief, not a value, nothing associated with the value attached to hard work in there, but it's an assertion about a connection between categories and outcome objects like hard work. It's not an evaluative comparison. Values refer to evaluative comparison, something that is more desirable than something else. This is not a desirability assessment. This is a truth assessment. And that's the sense in which I use the expression lay epistemology, the kind of epistemology that each of us takes to the world, that we've developed over time, that we've earned through our exchanges with the world. What do we think is true? It's not about what is good, but about what is correct. Those are different things. The function is to enhance the survival and functioning of a person in his or her social and physical environment. I'll say more about our developing a sense of what those functions are towards the end of the talk. The search for social axioms began in Hong Kong. Isn't it nice that we can start social scientific enterprises somewhere other than the United States of America? I mean, it's wonderful and encouraging, and if it encourages you outside of the mainstream to initiate your own work, that's terrific. And I might say that with the Chinese view, we're doing as much as we can to move the social scientific agenda forward by reversing the normal Marco Polo direction. My next-door neighbor, Fanny Jiang, has developed what I consider to be the sixth dimension of personality. We all know about the Big Five. Fanny has clearly identified, not only in Chinese culture, but also in Western cultures a sixth dimension, which he calls interpersonal relatedness. I think this is a hugely important personality dimension across which people vary. Some are very highly oriented towards interpersonal relations, others are quite clearly indifferent and unknowing about interpersonal relationships. And this fundamental dimension adds to what we already know in terms of the Big Five, but it emerged out of a Chinese cultural context. The work I'm going to describe clearly emerged out of a Chinese cultural context, but I think it's work that applies to the world and not merely to Hong Kong, as you'll see. So what we did was, 10 years ago, we began a project where we started talking to people, started to look through established texts, particularly texts of Proverbs, which has been some of my favorites for many years, newspaper articles. We interviewed citizens. We did focus interviews around a number of themes, asking them about what they believe with respect to a variety of domains, including things like how you socialize children. If you do this, what your children will become, da-da-da-da-da. That's a belief system, of course. Everyone wants their children to turn out right. The question is how to do it. Oprah has her ideas, and the Chinese people have theirs. Those are different beliefs, which may lead to very different parenting behaviors. Not the value of a good child. Everybody wants to raise their children wise. We all want wise children. How do you get there? That's hugely important. All right, so from that, well, in addition to that, we also looked at psychological scales that had already been developed in the literature, and one of the sobering things about these psychological scales is that so few of them measure beliefs. Most of them measure values, or most of them measure attitudes, which are combinations of valuational additions to social categories. The only two that really are relevant here is Roeder's measure of internal-external locus of control, for those of you who know some psychology, or Melvin Lerner's work on a belief in a just world. There were a few belief items found there. But I'm pointing out the paucity of items in the normal psychological literature that deal with belief. As I say, no pure belief scales in the psychological literature that we've been able to find. If you have any ideas about contenders, please let me know. I'm happy to hear about them. Most are attitude note with occasional belief items. Okay, extending the cultural range. Well, think, act locally, but think globally has always been my motto, because particularly I wanted to be able to talk about the Chinese not just as a contrast group with North Americans, or Canadians in my case, but I want to look at where the Chinese fit in terms of what you might call the psychography of the world. Where are they, and how do they differ among themselves, for example? There are many Chinese societies, as you know, and people get socialized into very different Chinese societies. Does that make anyone who calls themselves Chinese the same, or not? Well, how are we going to find out? As a social scientist, we're going to have to get involved in some measurement process. So that's exactly what we did in this particular project. We went to a rather unusual representative in the social science field, and that was Venezuela. We had a colleague, a very eager colleague in Venezuela at the time. She subsequently left over the problems that have emerged with the administration in Venezuela. But she was there, a fluent, American fluent Spanish speaker who had been working at Seaman Boulevard University for many years. She went through exactly the same kind of interview process as we did with her Venezuelan subjects. She knew nothing about the content of what we had been discovering. And so this was an attempt to use the same methodology to extract amicably responsive material from a very different cultural group, an underrepresented cultural group. Certainly in the cross-cultural area, Chinese and Japanese studies are hugely overrepresented relative to what we know from Latin America and Africa, which are certainly the dark horses, shall we say, in the social science discipline. So, Venezuela, she did the same thing. From those two studies, we found 33 similar clusters of belief with 182 items identified in both cultures. This belief survey was administered in 5 foundation cultures, Again, a rather unusual sample with the exception of Japan and the USA. So we really wanted to span the globe, as it were, in terms of getting our ideas about whether or not we were extracting items that were relevant in a number of cultures. 5 metrically equivalent factors were identified, and of course we were very eager and hoping that we had identified some universal dimension along which we could make comparisons. Briefly, they were the 5 factors. First of all, cynicism, which is basically a negative view of human nature and social events. I want to get a pithy expression for this that isn't rude. It's very hard to do that. And I have 2 candidates in the tip of my tongue, but I'm not going to utter them. I'll invite you perhaps to come up with some alternatives that I can use in subsequent lectures. But basically, as you see, as opposed to its opposite, some people are not cynical at all. They think that life works, that power is widely shared among people, that life will deliver good things if you simply live it out. Other people think that the cards are stacked against you from the start, that life's a jungle, or as Hobbes would have said, nature red in tooth and claw. Social complexity, there are multiple solutions to problems, and there is a high level of uncertainty in events, as opposed to people who have a more basic and fundamental and simple view of how social events transpire. Reward for application, I mentioned before. Personal investments of any sort. I'm not just talking money here, I'm talking about all of the force that individuals bring to events. Any kind of input made by you will result in a responsive output. Positive output. State control, this is an intriguing one. This is a deterministic view of social events as caused by external, non-social factors. Be that fate, luck, feng shui, the gods, or whatever. Notice this is a factor which is independent of, orthogonal to, the preceding 3. So you can have a high level of belief in fate control, as well as a high level of belief in reward for application, or not. These are orthogonal, independent constructs. And finally, religiosity. That is to say, people vary in terms of their beliefs in the existence of a supreme being. That's only one component of this factor. The other components are the positive consequences of religious belief and institution. Religious commitment makes good citizens. Religious institutions promote a harmonious society. This is a belief system. Not a value. Everyone wants a harmonious society. What does religion lead to harmony or disharmony? That's a very striking difference across persons. So those are the basic 5. We'll come back to them with their definers a little later on. And there's nothing copyrighted about this material. I hate to see you folks turning into Xerox machines. I am happy to send you a PowerPoint copy of whatever I presented here. And I think maybe Pacific Rim does a kind of synopsis, does it not?
Your MP3 will be viewable on our website.
That'll be about as exciting as watching paint dry. Well, anyway, thank you. Round the world study, okay. So we moved beyond the foundation study because now we wanted to go global, you might say. We wanted to know whether these, how this played out, how this system played out when we had a very wide sample. We wanted to ensure that we were not biasing the outcomes by a selected set of inputs. And so we spanned the globe in various ways using our contacts over many years, plus a little financial inducement, to collect data from samples around the world, as many samples as we could get. I'm very pleased that we got some of our samples because we have samples here that are not normally represented in the literature. You don't find many studies with Iranian subjects, for example, in multicultural work. I'm delighted about that. And of course, Walk and I have been members of various international associations for many years, and we were able to like one high and make something happen in terms of samples from various unusual countries like Latvia, for example, some of the newly emerging countries under the communist state. We also had adults. We wanted to make sure that whatever we found with students, university students, would be validated with adults. And we used a rather technical procedure for extracting comparable dimensions of comparison that need not concern us here. It's a much more technical issue that concerns social scientists. So we really did go global. We're not overrepresented in Africa by any means. We have a very good representation in South America, however, weak in Central America, but we're doing very well, I must say, in Asia, and as you'll see in a minute. Okay, now when we go through this whole procedure with now 40 samples, different cultural groups, this is what we get. These are the items that describe and define a person as being high on social cynicism, or cynicism, depending on how you define it. I think social cynicism is redundant, is it not? I'm trying to work it out. Should we say social cynicism or cynicism? Are you cynical about yourself? You're only cynical about things out there. Yeah, not yourself. That would be sort of what, pessimistic maybe? So anyway, I've bounced back and forth. Naming these dimensions is one of the real bugbears of doing this kind of work. So we started with social cynicism. I changed it for today's presentation to cynicism because I think it might be redundant, but I'll be interested to hear your ideas. Anyway, this is what you endorse to get a very high score on social cynicism. Does this fit what you believe, or do you disagree with what is being asserted here? Does this represent your position about the world that you confront when you walk out of, well, maybe when you walk into your home? I don't know if that's out of your home in the morning or into your home as well, because that's also part of our life, is it not? That's cynicism. Powerful people tend to exploit others. The positive side would be life at the beach. I suppose the appropriate rendering of this is life is something else, but not the beaches. All right? Cynicism. Social complexity. People have opposite behaviors on different occasions. Now, it's hard for me as a social scientist to believe that there are people who disbelieve that statement, but there are lots of people around here who think that people are very consistent from time A to time B in situation A to situation B. They would get low scores on social complexity. One has to deal with matters according to the specific circumstances. Again, most of us would say, of course, I mean, it's obvious. Basic Sun Tzu art of war, is it not? But no, there are lots of people who think there's a one-size-fits-all approach to basic issues in human life. So there's the contrasting feature. Reward for application. Every problem has a solution. And it is wrong. Sorry, that's the cynicism. Knowledge is necessary for success. Anyway, those were our attempts to integrate those items which hang together among people in all 40 cultural groups. This is a very constant, universal pattern of associations among items, which we would regard as a construct that survives the winnowing process of being assessed at the individual level in more than 40 cultural groups.
So, Michael, were they, were people rating these?
Yes, a simple 5-point scale. Strongly agree, don't know, disagree, strongly disagree. We didn't make it any more sophisticated than that. We don't want this discovery to be about scales. We want it to be about, and most people have no problem saying that. Do you believe in God? Well, yeah, I don't know. Or, yes, of course. You know, we can manage those distinctions, I think. Fate control. Oh, now this is one of the most interesting dimensions to emerge. And we're talking about the real world here. Individual characteristics such as appearance and birthday affect one's fate. That's the defining item there, but there are other ways. Most disasters can be predicted. Fate determines one's successes and failures. Good luck follows if one survives a disaster. This works in all horticultural groups. These hang together so that somebody who's high in one will be high in the other. There are no reverse set scored items there. But what I want to point out, something interesting to me, there are certain ways to help us improve our luck and avoid unlucky things. So in addition, allied with the sense that we are under control of external factors, big factors, not social factors, but big factors like the Greek gods and all of that stuff, Zeus throwing thunderbolts, is the sense that we can do things. So, as a compensatory mechanism, perhaps, for being controlled, is the belief that you can do certain things. Any Chinese person in the audience will know, of course, how carefully a lot of Chinese persons will organize their office space for feng shui, for example. That would be a specific exemplar of how you want to work with the forces that are out there, that are not human forces out there, and ally yourself and put yourself into a proper relationship with those forces. Chinese garden design, for example, might have something to do with that kind of work. That environments make a difference. And there are ways in which you can use the principles that underlie those differences to put yourself into a more harmonious relationship with them.
Michael, can I ask a question?
Yes.
We talk about naming right?
Yeah.
When you say fate control, are you referring to control by fate or control of fate?
May I? We worked so hard with that one. We wanted to create that deliberate ambivalence, because it is both sides. That is, not only are you controlled by fate, but you have some control over fate. And that's an intriguing marriage to me. Because if you think of how many times you and yourself engage in attempts to control forces beyond yourself, and how many friends of yours read the horoscope and go to palm readers and do all kinds of things that would put them into a better relationship with fate. Indeed, that's exactly why we chose that term, deliberate ambiguity. Now, because we're trapped by the items that were elicited from our subject, we haven't really looked at the full range of items that deal with how we as individuals attempt to control fate. And I think that's partly where culture will exercise its socializing influence on the individuals in that culture. We will be taught as we grow up how to do certain things in order to put ourselves into a better relationship with fate, the forces of nature that are out there. Assuming we grow up in a society that believes there are forces of nature out there other than human forces. And many of us get socialized to believe there isn't anything out there except what we bring as individuals and as social agents to the drama of life. We try to declaw nature, as it were. Okay, now, I said I would elaborate a little bit on what we think the functions are. Of course, basically we have a kind of functionalist point of view that our job, our basic human agenda is survival, of course, but also what you might call self-extension in the broadest sense of the word, doing something useful, meaningful, effective in the world. Not merely eating, sleeping, and reproducing, but also getting on with the basic functions of life, the other more elevated functions of life, the civilized functions of life, you might say. Now, we think that each of the 5 dimensions that I've identified over on the right relates to one of 3 fundamental issues that confront everybody in all social systems at all times in history. We were watching Troy last night, you know, the new film with, as my daughters would say, Brad Pitt. And as I was watching this, and it's a very realistic and graphic, rare representation of life at that time, warring life at that time, Spartan wars and so forth. Even they had to deal with these sorts of fundamental issues. Now, the first issue is the issue of what is out there that is good for you? What is out there that is dangerous for you? Are other people particularly dangerous for you, or are they good for you? And we think that your position on cynicism is an answer to that particular question. We always socialize our children to be attentive to people who are good for them and bad for them, and to avoid what is bad and to approach what is good as best we can. And we think that cynicism is the position that people end up adopting, either cynical or non-cynical, with respect to the question of whether the world out there is a dangerous, malevolent entity that you must confront continually throughout the life course, or whether life's a beach. Social life, interpersonal life, work life, and so forth. Now, of course, we also have the job of survival and self-extension, and that involves being effective problem solvers, figuring out how the world works so that we can then position ourselves more effectively to deal with that world. And we think the issues of fate control, reward gratification, and social complexity all inform us about the person's position with regard to these three fundamental issues that assist us with problem solving. Take rewards for application, for example. How are you going to solve the problems of life? Well, a particular problem has to be dealt with by, can be dealt with by an investment of resources or not. Maybe problems are not solvable, in which case you would not believe in rewards for application. That would be your issue. The problem will be solved in some other way than my investing a personal input into the problem, as opposed to individuals who are high in reward for application, who would have developed over the course of their socialization the belief that if they don't just stand there, do something. That's the fundamental reward for application position.
And that has nothing to do with search for meaning.
No, well, it may. Do you see some connection?
Well, I think if you believe that your work is purposeful, then you might think that there's meaning.
Well, it depends what the meaning is. The meaning is the meaning survival. Indeed, it would be purposeful. But you could, yes, that would be a little different. And that's where we think the search for meaning connects to the issue of your position on religiosity. Now, we think that the desire, there's a need for self-extension and for making sense of the life that we're leading, not merely in terms of physical survival. Now, whether you do that by referring to a religious dimension to life, and whether religious institutions, will be part of enabling that kind of self-extension is, of course, the differentiating issue with regard to this dimension. Lots of people find meaning in life in different ways than endorsing a religious worldview with respect to their beliefs. Now, that's just our current thinking on this issue, because if we have these five functions, if they're found in all 40 cultures, what are they doing? What issue are they addressing across people within societies and across societies? And this is our first take on this issue. We're now beginning to think about it, but we can't, of course, think about it too well until we get further research that specifically looks at these individual dimensions and begins to explore their predictive power. Now, brace yourself.
Take quick note.
This is the big picture of the 40 societies that we have up and down the line. I'll give you an easier way to look at them. Take, for example, the reward for application, and we take the average score of the Malaysians and compare it to the average scores of the Dutch. We find a difference on a 5-point scale, 3.18 to 4.29. That's a rather dramatic difference when you think you have only a 5-point scale here. And that spans, those are the two endpoints on this particular dimension. Interestingly, the Dutch are rather neutral with respect to a belief in reward for application. The Malaysians are very clear in their mind that if you invest more of anything, more will come from the world in response to that input that you've made. Now that's reward for application. Here's social complexity. Here's cynicism. Here's religiosity. Religiosity, Pakistani, Malaysian, Indonesian, Iranian, Nigerian. Now I don't know whether this Nigerian group is Hausa, Igbo, or Yoruba. I'm having a little trouble getting an email response out of my collaborator in Nigeria. But if it is, which one is the Muslim group of those three? Anybody know? There are three basic groups, and you know they're currently warring in Kano, up in Nigeria, and that's a religious dispute between the Muslims. But here we have a very strong grouping. Certainly we have at least 4 Muslim groups: Pakistani, Malaysian, Indonesian, and Iranian, and they're at the top of that heap. And look at the difference between 4.15 and 3.67 is the next. I mean, is that a huge commitment to religion as a socializing, binding, positive force? Now, you may say force or evil, but that's not going to be the point of view of the persons who endorse that belief system, of course. But it may, that belief in that, in religiosity as an institution, may be part of what's providing the animus in the cross-cultural confrontation that Huntington was talking about in the Clash of Civilization. Now, this is obviously too much to absorb, but this is the basic input that we're going to use here. We take the average score from any given group. Here are the Taiwanese, for example, on reward for application. And they are 3.687. And we have 39 other scores on reward for application, and of course across the 5 dimensions we have 200 different average scores of the citizen groups, balanced for gender, in those various societies. Now, how can we start making some sense out of all of these numbers? Yes?
For the Canadian group, is it Anglophone or Francophone?
It's Anglophone. Thank you for pointing that out. I would love to get a French-Canadian sample. We've got Hetsing Yale has been getting American samples, and you sometimes get quite dramatic differences between, say, Chinese American and Japanese American. So I'd be intrigued to see what the French would do. I really wish we could get that kind of work.
And then for the Chinese, is it just from the major cities, or do you have?
Indeed, these are surrogate citizen scores. I use citizen in a rather loose sense here because they are all university samples. Now, in China, of course, as you know, as you may know, I'm learning, apparently a nationwide system of examinations is run, and if you go to Beida, where we got this data, Beijing University, you get students who come from all over China. They're simply the best students, but they come from all over China. They're very competitive in that sense. So it's not regional the way a lot of Canadian universities might be regional, for example. All right, now, let's simplify this a little bit in ways that social scientists attempt to simplify. This is what's called a cluster analysis, for those of you who know it. It looks at the average amount of difference between any 2 partners, any 2 entities, and goes through some statistical hocus pocus that I don't fully understand, but this is a least squares solution, and it tells you who is closest to whom. And this will begin to allow us to winnow this data set in ways that address the question that animates this presentation, which is, where's the Chinese in all of this? Is there a Chinese position, for example? Now, we have 4 Chinese societies. Let me mark them a little bit differently here, if I locate them all. Here is China. This should be Chinese, of course, not China, I'm sorry. Singaporean is over there. Where is Hong Kong? Oh, yeah, here we are, Hong Kong Chinese, and there's a 4th one, Taiwanese should be in here somewhere.
Right here, Bob.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'm glad you guys know. There are 4 Chinese societies. I'm delighted to say it. This is one of the few studies that has 4. Hofstede only has 3. We have 4. And will give us some idea where Chinese can be located with respect to one another. But you will notice that those 4 Chinese societies are not very neighborly. I say neighborly in the physical sense of being close to one another, because this kind of statistical printout will tell you who is most similar to whom. Now, brace yourself, Canadians, because I'm about to give you the facts of belief life. If you have a look up here, you'll see where the American Caucasians are, and you'll see where the Canadians are. This is what we call, in the statistical literature, dancing cheek to cheek. So we're not going to get any satisfaction for Canadian nationalism out of this particular belief statement. Now, maybe there'll be some other data produced at some later time that will give Canadian satisfaction. Maybe handshaking procedures will allow us to distinguish the Americans from the Canadians. But certainly belief systems do not do so. They come out together very quickly. That is, this diagram tells you how long does it take before you become similar to any people from another particular group. The sooner you become similar, the closer you are. The Yorubans in Nigeria, it's Yorubans. I should have known that. Okay. The Yorubans are very close. Sorry. The Koreans are very close to the Russians. That may surprise you. It certainly surprised me. Canadians and Americans, I don't think surprise too many of us. We put our hands over our hearts instead of over our flag. Have a look, though, at the Chinese groupings. There are no very quick alliances among the Chinese group. The Hong Kong Chinese dances most quickly with the Latvians after 2 steps in the groupings. And who would have ever predicted that? And where are the Chinese, Oh, okay, not bad. All right. Now, there's another way in which we can spin this, but you'll notice that there are 2 rather prominent groupings here. Look at the Islamic groupings, Indonesian, Malaysian, Iranian, and Pakistani. Particularly those 3 come out as a tight little cluster in here, and there's no other group that intervenes among those 3. Now, this is a very interesting finding, I think, with respect to recent developments since 9/11, because, indeed, as I said before, Muslim groups are not well represented in the social scientific literature. We have to go back to Lawrence of Arabia or Willard Thesiger to find out what the Arabs are like. And I think maybe that Muslim injunction against representing the human form in art extended to representing the psyche. And so there's not a lot of research done. To my knowledge, this data from Iran was provided by Sabat Sattar at the University of Guelph, who had an Iranian friend who taught psychology, who teaches psychology in Tehran, and was able to get this data for us, these data. I don't know how I would have got it otherwise. I'm delighted that she's enabled us to do that, because I've had a long-standing interest in Muslim society, and was very interested to see where they locate themselves with respect to the rest of the planet. Okay, let's move on a bit. How are we doing for time? All right. Correlations with social indicators. Now, you can take these citizen scores and you can say, well, so what? What do they enable us to predict? What are they connected to? Is there any meaning? You know, it's one thing to describe the world, and there have been thousands of ways to describe the world, but does it do any good for us? There have been many map makers, but not all maps work. You know, and so in the sense of working for us as social scientists, the issue would be, what does it enable us to understand that makes sense, that helps us to position ourselves with the world and to know how things are working out there? Well, cynicism and life satisfaction scores are fascinating, I think. People who believe that life is a beach are more satisfied with their life when they're asked in Ronald Englehart's survey of 45 countries on the level of life satisfaction, and quite a different survey, a representative sample that they used at the World Values Survey that Englehart has done 3 times now over the last 3 decades. We get a very high correlation with the cynicism score. The extent to which you have a cynical belief system, you are less satisfied. You report being less satisfied with life. Reward for application. I like this one. Working hours per week. You know, the International Labor Organization publishes the number of hours per week that people work in different monasteries. We in Hong Kong work about 67. You in Canada, it seems, don't work on Saturdays and Sundays, so that immediately takes you out of the game. Unless you count, well, maybe I shouldn't say. Religiosity, hedonic balance. That is positive minus negative affect correlates 4/7 with religiosity. There's a reasonably close correlation with how religious you are in your belief system and the extent to which you experience positive as opposed to negative emotions when you are asked and time sampled across a period in a longitudinal study. Faith control. People who believe in faith control have higher levels of heart disease and a higher suicide rate. Now, can we make sense of that? Well, Baumeister's theory about suicide as escape from self has a whole set of interesting propositions that relate to the extent to which you see your life as under your control or under the control of malevolent forces. And if you are socialized into a system that believes that life is under control of external forces, then it's very understandable that in times of crisis, high levels of pain as you grow old, for example, interpersonal challenges and difficulties that you may have, that you would be inclined to revert to suicide as an escape from the problems that you experience if you have a belief in faith, high level of belief in faith. Social complexity, percentage of the population showing an interest in politics. This is intriguing. Probably also if we had good figures for voting rates, we might find that social complexity is also associated with higher levels of political participation. Now, this is just a sample of a whole set of findings that we have been able to extract by using these citizen scores and correlating them with other available indices that are published for other purposes by other people in other places. There are all kinds of them. I was talking with Dr. Walls at lunch about human rights observance, for example. Humana in '92 has published the third edition of his work on human rights around the world, where he scores each nation in terms of the degree to which it subscribes in action to the United Nations Covenant on Civil and Political Liberties. China, for example, in the first issue, got a score of 25. New Zealand got a score of 99 out of 100. So he's ranked 100 different societies, scored them, and that correlates quite strongly with cynicism. That is to say, people who are cynical come from societies with low levels of human rights observance. You might say that makes very good, perfect sense. That somebody who grows up in an environment where human rights are not observed, when students look like relative to the average score in blue. Blue represents the midpoint. Here, for example, on cynicism is right at just below the mean of 3, and Hong Kong citizens, students at least, are about a quarter of a point above that midpoint. They're higher on religiosity than the world average, if I can call it the world average, from 40 countries. Now, what I'm going to do is take you through the other Chinese samples that we have in our population in order to help identify where the similarities, if they exist, among Chinese persons exist and where they do not exist. So here we have China. This is PRC Chinese. And those of you who do this kind of work will appreciate just how large that difference is. Because we're dealing here with averages now, not two individual scores, but two average scores across two social systems. So a very much lower level of religiosity, undoubtedly one of the sequelae of the Cultural Revolution and the attempts that China has engineered over the years to suppress any kind of authority other than that of the party. State control higher than that of the world average and indeed the Hong Kong Chinese. In other respects, pretty similar. What's next? Okay. These are the Taiwanese. Now, again, we're starting to break apart the monolith of Chinese cultures here. Taiwanese are higher in faith control even than the Chinese, and certainly much higher than the world average where the Hong Kong Chinese locate themselves. Taiwanese about average with respect to religiosity, and pretty much average with respect to the others. Next, Singaporeans. Look at the state control in Singapore. Wow, Lee Kuan Yew is really having an influence. Recently he was interviewed and asked about the secret of Singapore's success, and I love his answer. You know what he said? The air conditioner. That's not state control. Air conditioners were not created by the Greek gods, you know. State control. And anyway, and remarkably low on cynicism. This is a Pollyanna society. From a cynic's point of view, this is a Pollyanna society. Singaporeans love fun. And wouldn't regard it as Pollyanna at all, but it's reality, the way things are. But again, look at the contrast here on cynicism between the Singaporeans and the Taiwanese. Taiwanese are really quite high cynicism. Okay, by way of contrast, here are the Canadians, with whom you're familiar. Now, those are really quite striking contrasts. Very low state control, almost one of the lowest in the sample, and very low levels of cynicism. Canadians are really Vancouverized on a bright, sunny Saturday afternoon, skateboarding in Kitsilano Park. Life is fine. The institutions work. We're not at war with one another. There's no potential for civil unrest. Our only problem is south of it. And as a final contrast, I add in the Filipinos. I've been quite interested in Filipino society for some time. My wife and I are thinking of retiring there. So I have some interest in it. I also have an interest for intellectual reasons because in the original Hofstede work, Filipino society is regarded as very collectivist. But as you know, the Japanese and the Chinese have carried the ball in terms of social science collectivism for many, many decades. We hardly know anything about other collectivists. And yet we cavalierly talk about how collectivists are as if the Confucian model of collectivism is the only way to be collectivist. Now you see that the Filipinos here are quite different from any of the Chinese samples, certainly in respect to some of their belief systems. Look at the reward for application. How in the Philippines can you have such a high level of reward for application? Can you imagine? I mean, chaos unleashed, and yet people are busy doing what they need to do in order to get ahead. There's a strong belief in investment, whatever form of investment may take, to make things better. There's always hope. You can even become a domestic ama in Canada. We know because we're trying to get a Filipino to take care of our grandson so that my daughter can be busy being a PhD because she works in a society where women are liberated and can get higher degrees and need household help in order to keep their husbands from having to learn how to change diapers. You probably know how to do that very well.
Still among university students.
Exactly. Still among university, yes. Yes.
You expect reward for application to open university.
Yeah, but these are all university students. And now I haven't shown you some of the other ones down here, but the European countries are very low. They'll be down at this range on reward for application. Now, in general, they're above the midpoint. That is to say, they believe, most of them, in some level of outcome for input. But the Filipinos are one of the highest in the sample that we have. So this is a graphic way to represent Chinese epistemology. I'll bring some conclusions here of the similarities and differences across these four societies. And my answer is, again, another Escher print. There's no single Chinese profile. Here's your take-home message, at least with respect to beliefs. Now, in the Handbook of Chinese Psychology, I reviewed what we knew about Chinese values. And there is a similarity with respect to Chinese regarding values. They clearly endorse hierarchy or power or wealth or money at a higher level than do people in other social systems. That's value. Beliefs, we don't see a similar single Chinese profile. There's wide variation across cynicism, religiosity, and state control. Wide variation. Greater similarity in social complexity and reward for application. Now, this pattern is understandable as affluence is the best predictor of citizen scores on any of the 5 dimensions across the 40 nations. Now, I say the best predictor, I should say it's the only predictor, and it's not that good. The percentage of variance that we can explain by using affluence scores is about 30%, which is social scientific speak for saying there's 70% of the variation which we cannot explain. We do not have the necessary measurement tool or conceptual measure for what links to different positions on these 5 dimensions of belief. We don't know yet. But of course, every discovery stimulates an enlargement of our understanding, and it's provoking us to begin looking, for example, at what are the aspects of religious traditions, philosophical traditions that may be part of the explanatory package here, over and above what is required to socialize people to function in a sophisticated modern society. Clearly, many of these beliefs help us get along in a more advanced society. For example, affluence is predicted by lower levels of cynicism, predicts lower levels of cynicism. How about social complexities? Do people in affluent societies have higher or lower? Do you have a sense of this? Higher. Yeah. They see things in more complex ways. Life is filled with a variety of opposing forces, and to be effective, you need to respond to the realities of that kind of social situation, which is indeed a much more complex situation. Higher complexity. Reward for application, higher or lower? One would have thought so, and I certainly would have predicted so. It's exactly the opposite. The wealthier the society, the greater input will lead to an outcome. And it may be precisely because people are embedded within much more sophisticated, differentiated social structures where any particular individual input has a lesser social output.
So this is affluence as a society, not that you
As a society, yes, not personally. Now, that's a very good point, because it would be very nice if we start to do studies within a society. We look at variations within a society on belief positions, and then education is huge. I'm sure it's going to be huge. I'm sure we're going to get the same kind of results with beliefs as Melvin Cohen got for values, where he found that preparation for working class life, working class parents inculcated a very different value profile in their children than professional parents, along the conformity versus independence dimension, for example, the achievement dimension, the submission dimension, and so forth, the restrictive conformity dimension. Very dramatic differences within a society. Socialization patterns, of course, warmth, boldness, control, autonomy, and specific verbal inputs. I'm watching my daughter raise my grandson, and it's extraordinary to watch the level of sophisticated verbal inputs that are being made to a 2-year-old, for goodness sake, at this stage. Now, not all parents do that, and certainly across social class, we know that there are very dramatic differences in language use of parents towards children as a function of social class. Most parents don't have time to give that kind of input for a start, nor do they have the skills to give that kind of differentiated verbal input. So I'm sure we get some of that, and I wait for this kind of work to be done. But people aren't going to do this kind of work if they're still fixated on values. And we're going to have to give them some sense that there's gold in them, these are hills. That's going to do some work for us if we do it. Okay, faith control, high or low in affluent society? No, low. It's the other way around. Religiosity, high or low? Lower. Much lower in affluent society. So there's a kind of affluence profile with respect to beliefs, in the same way that there's an affluence profile with respect to values. If you have a look in the Engelhardt work, there's very clear differentiation, secularism and values, as opposed to traditionalism and values as a function of affluence. Before you ask, I'll tell you about gender effects. There are differences, vive la différence. And that's it. Males are more cynical, no difference in social complexity, reward for application. Females are more religious, and females are more likely to believe in faith control. My daughter assures me that if you've ever had to give birth to a child, you know all about fate control. What else can I tell you? Well, I won't go into this at this point. Let me move more quickly towards a conclusion here and draw out some of what we have and suggest what we might glean from this for our work in Chinese culture. Hello? Trying to talk to you. I don't know.
I click OK first and then go back to that.
Thanks. I'm starting a campaign to eliminate paper clips. Free to join up. Sign. I'll be happy to send you the PowerPoint if you sign. Social activism of the psychological effective culture. All right. Beliefs are very easy to assess. People know what they believe. They don't know what they value so much. You should see people try to fill out a short value survey. They agonize. He begins by saying, which of these 30 values is of supreme importance to you? You've got to select one from his list of 30. And people sit there forever, comparing these other 29 values. And they finally decide. And then they have to rank the others with respect to that supreme value. And then he has a second list of 30, which they have to do. He's been recently trying to simplify this. But these are easy. People finish a belief survey in 5 minutes. We know what we believe and what we don't believe. It's remarkable. So it's a tool in that respect. High levels of stability in beliefs across time, by the way. You get a measure, it lasts, it fixates the person in a certain position. They don't much change. It's a key aspect of our socialization into the world. I will say that it's one of the very few instruments that has been assessed at the individual level across as many societies. It is the only instrument that I know that's been assessed across so many societies at the individual level. This works. Even more than the McRae and Costa 5-factor inventory, which has now been calculated in 36 countries, although McRae, being McRae, will be able to get many more cultures than we will, probably faster. But anyway, it's a very solid psychological level measure that works in the same way across a lot of societies, and that's what we need for cross-cultural comparison. Its average scores in a nation relate differently and sensibly to societal level indicators. It adds power to that game by measuring value in predicting individual behavior. You remember I said there's no point adding a new construct to our armamentarium in social science unless it does something extra. So we always do a head-to-head comparison between values and beliefs, allowing values to take the first chunk of the prediction. It enters as block 1 in regression, for those of you who do this kind of statistical work. It's like getting to the buffet table first. You get all the shrimp. So, now if we put beliefs in first, of course, it'd look as if it was useful, right? Because it'd get whatever it could possibly get. But we put values in first, and then we enter beliefs to see if they add predictive power, and so far, they do very well to add additional variance. So we've got something that does something more than values. I'm not saying there's any problem with values. Values are a very useful motivational construct that we need to understand people. But beliefs are also such a construct. Resource in studying Chinese culture. Well, here's a feng shui compass for those of you who have never seen one. It's a beautiful piece of work, tantalizing in its complexity, but that wonderful circle, 4-pointed circle. Look at that yin yang. Terrific. Culture-specific actions may be added to the core defining elements of the 5 basic dimensions for what you might call eminent sensitivity. We have here the core defining items, but in any particular cultural group there will be additional items that characterize fate control, for example. What are the ways of thinking about forces, non-social external forces? What are they called? There will be additional kinds of identifications in every cultural group. The gods in Greek society were external forces. No, we don't use that expression in our culture. We don't think of it. We may think God is an external force, but we don't think of the gods in the way that they were thinking about in that film. Domain-specific belief systems like feng shui or theories of health. Any of you who've grown up in Chinese culture know about the extensive, elaborate, important theories of health practices that Chinese people have. If you do this, then this will happen. If you eat shrimp when you're pregnant, the child will have a hair lip. That's a belief, by the way. Nobody wants a hair lip for their child. But how do you prevent your child from having a hair lip? Well, here's a whole theory about health practices that pregnant mothers can engage in to avoid having an undesirable outcome. Now, we don't have that in our cultural system. It's an annex or a culture-specific belief system. Okay, so for further scholarship, for those of you who I list 3 articles, one of which is about to come out in the Advances in Experimental Psych, which characterize and summarize this work that we've been doing for the last decade. I was reasonably good. Oh, no, I wasn't. So we didn't start late, didn't we?
You believe you're good.
There's time for a few questions, if you would like to ask some questions. Let me get a sense of who's asking some questions.
Yes, I noticed that in the reward of application, that there was a direct relationship between low-scoring countries or countries with a high social security.
With a high
social security.
Absolutely. That's another one of the institutions that may buffer the inputs that an individual may make, and may also attenuate the need to make those inputs. If you can be taken care of because social institutions exist to feed and clothe you, then there's less pressure. And indeed, that may